just gets a complete refresh. Well, buckle up, because that's pretty much exactly what's happening with the Man of Steel right now. Today we're taking a deep dive into James Gunn's highly anticipated new film, Superman.
Yeah.
It's flying into theaters this week. And it's not just, another superhero movie. It's really the launch pad for an entirely new DC universe. We've got a stack of fascinating sources here, a range of critical reviews from places like The Hollywood Reporter, The New York Times, Forbes, IGN.
Right, and insights into the film's box office, the budget from Screen Rant.
Exactly. And even a look at some of the early controversies swirling around its themes, thanks to NBC News for that reporting. So our mission, really, is to unpack what makes this Superman different. What are critics actually saying? How's it doing financially? And, well, why is it sparking so much conversation?
Yeah, trying to help you cut through the noise and get a clearer picture of this. Well, it's a pretty monumental new release.
Okay, let's unpack this new Superman from the ground up.
Yeah.
The first thing that really jumps out is the director, James Gunn himself. I mean, he's made quite a significant jump, right?
Right.
From creating the beloved Guardians of the Galaxy films for Marvel
Shop.
to now being the co-CEO of DC Studios and writing and directing this new Superman. That's a massive leap of faith for the studio, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And what's particularly illuminating, I think, is how Gunn's really unique background seems to inform his approach here. He actually cut his teeth at Troma Entertainment, which has been called an absolute outermost fringe of the film industry, writing films like Romeo and Juliet.
Larry.
Yeah. So that experience seems to have given him this sense of maybe irreverence, a willingness to go against the grain, even when he's working with these massive studio budgets.
And you can see that unconventional approach immediately in his creative choices for this film. Like you said, bold move. This isn't another origin story.
Yeah, not at all.
The movie just kind of plops us into a world where Superman is already an adult, Lois and Clark are already dating, and the world is, pretty accustomed to metahumans. It also very consciously sheds that somber gloominess that critics really noted had hung over the previous Zack Snyder DC cinematic universe.
A very deliberate shift.
So by skipping the origin story, embracing this brighter tone, what kind of statement is Gunn making for this new DC universe right out of the gate?
Well, it's a very deliberate statement, I think. This approach immediately sets a different mood, right? Signals a departure. And when you look at the themes Gunn himself described from the red carpet interviews, he believes we're, quote, dying for someone too earnest, too kind. And for those old-fashioned things that we love of just looking out for people in need, he sort of sees the film as a direct response to some modern ideas, like the notion that the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. Yeah, he seems to be aiming to reconnect with our humanity. It suggests a strategic move, maybe, to bring back a more hopeful, perhaps even a more classic interpretation of Superman after years of darker takes.
That sounds like a fascinating creative gamble. Now, okay, one of the biggest questions for any new superhero film is always, who's in the suit?
Always.
David Corenswet. He's the fourth actor to don Superman's cape for a DC feature film. How does his performance fit into this new, more earnest vision?
Well, if we look at the critical consensus so far, Corenswet's performance is being pretty widely praised. Critics are noting he really captures the sincerity and the humanity of the character in a really winning fashion, reveals his vulnerability, his fallibility, too.
So not just the strong jawline, then?
Well, maybe that, too, but they're focusing on the depth. While some acknowledge he might not, surpass Christopher Reeve's beloved portrayal.
Which is a high bar.
An incredibly high bar. But several critics are saying he comes close. He portrays a Superman trying to do good on a very pure, fundamental level, even when he's misread by this cynical world.
Okay.
So it really sounds like he is embodying that empathetic core Gunn seems to be aiming for.
It sounds like Corenswet is pretty key to grounding this new Superman. But, who is Superman without Lois Lane? Rachel Brosnahan plays Lois. And reviewers are calling her portrayal whip-smart, captivating, highlighting her funny, scrappy rapport with Clark. One critic even notes where Lois doesn't really need saving and knows how to grill a source.
Love that.
Is this a Lois for a new era?
Absolutely, it sounds like it. The description of Brosnahan's Lois suggests a character with real agency, real wit, someone who's a true partner rather than just, the damsel in distress. This portrayal seems to be resonating strongly, making her a compelling force alongside Superman. Okay,
then there's Lex Luthor, played by Nicholas Hoult. And here's where it gets a bit more mixed.
Definitely seeing that.
On the one hand, one review describes him as menacing and evil, and even compares him to Elon Musk but wicked smart. Which is, wow. Yeah, that's quite the comparison.
Yeah.
Suggests a very modern, maybe chilling take on Lex.
But then other critics have been much less impressed, calling him an angry frat boy, lacking depth and gravitas, with a, quote, goofy plan to annex a third world country.
Goofy isn't usually what you want for your main villain.
Right, that's a pretty wide range of opinion for the main antagonist.
It truly highlights the varied reception of the film's antagonist, and it's a crucial point, I think. For a new cinematic universe, establishing a compelling villain is just paramount. So the Elon Musk but wicked smart comparison sounds intriguing, but the angry frat boy critique points to maybe a potential misfire in terms of gravitas or depth.
Yeah.
The success of a villain often dictates the dramatic stakes, right? So this split reception for Lex Luthor is definitely something to keep an eye on as more people see the film. And speaking of unexpected delights, who could have possibly predicted the standout performance would come from? Krypto the Superdog.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
Apparently so.
And what's really charming here is that Gunn actually modeled Krypto on his own real-life rescue dog, Ozu.
Oh, that's nice.
It is, and critics universally adore the CGI pup, calling him 100% adorable, providing goofy charm. One reviewer even admits Krypto alone won me over and had them at Krypto.
Wow.
And get this, another critic, who was largely negative about the film overall, completely loved Krypto. They quoted Clark saying, "He isn't even a very good dog, but he's out there alone and scared. I have to find him."
Oh.
And that critic said this was the only moment they felt real emotion in the whole movie.
That says a lot.
It really does. Just goes to show how sometimes the smallest, most unexpected elements can truly capture an audience's heart.
Okay, beyond the core trio and the super pup, Gunn also brings in some lesser-seen comic book characters, as the sources put it.
Yeah, digging into the DC bench a bit.
We see Nathan Fillion as Guy Gardner Green Lantern, Isabel Merced as Hawkgirl, and Edi Gathegi as Mr. Terrific. They apparently make up the Justice Gang.
The Justice Gang, okay.
Some critics enjoyed their dynamic, called it funny, with Gathegi providing a deadpan counterpoint to Fillion's silly swagger. Sounds like Fillion doing Fillion.
Which can be very entertaining.
Totally.
Yeah.
However, some criticism points to the massive cast being, well, bafflingly massive, leading to underutilized characters.
Yeah.
Like Wendell Pierce's Perry White, who one critic said basically chews on a cigar.
Ouch, yeah.
Is there a risk of just overstuffing the narrative when you're trying to launch an entire new universe like this?
Oh, absolutely. That's a significant challenge. While it's exciting for fans, to see these characters introduced, there's always the risk of a bafflingly massive cast just diluting the focus. If characters feel underutilized, they can end up feeling more like Easter eggs than essential parts of the story.
Right.
And that can really detract from the pacing and the character development you need in that first outing. It's a really delicate balance when you're setting up a long-term universe.
So we know Gunn's avoiding the origin story, dropping us right into the action. What are the immediate pros and cons of that approach for, the viewer's experience, particularly when it comes to pacing and the overall plot?
Well, on the one hand, some critics describe the film as relentlessly entertaining. They praise its energy, its ability to bring back a sense of wonder. They highlight plenty of action from searing, windswept flying sequences to Superman battling a giant kaiju. So this kind of no-holds-barred approach can definitely be a welcome burst of energy for the genre.
That does sound like a potentially refreshing change of pace for superhero films. But I've also heard some murmurs, like you hinted, about the pacing feeling maybe too fast. Are critics split on whether this high-octane approach really serves the story well?
They absolutely are split. Other viewpoints suggest that the film is overloaded, even muddled at times.
Muddled, okay.
Yeah, with an overstuffed, badly paced plot that seems to just race from one action sequence to the next, leaving, quote, little room for character development. One critic even used the phrase, the and then narrative trap, suggesting events just happen one after another without strong causality or consequence.
Okay. So just things happening, not necessarily a strong story driving them?
That's the critique from some corners, yes. So while some see relentless entertainment, others feel it sacrifices depth for speed.
And this seems to extend to the film's tone as well. Many critics appreciate its sincere but also goofy nature, describing it as bringing optimism, hope, and care back to Superman. They note that Gunn carries over that sort of unhinged, off-kilter fun from his previous films, like Guardians.
Yeah, that signature Gunn style.
Which sounds like a distinct new flavor for DC.
Indeed, it suggests a pretty confident creative direction, aiming for that balance of earnestness and humor that feels uniquely Gunn.
But here's where we get a really strong counterargument. A different take from one quite prominent review calls the film a tonal disaster.
Oof, disaster is strong.
Very strong. Arguing that Gunn can't seem to settle on a tone. They felt Superman's optimism was kind of wedged into the plot, not organic. And that the humor, while it's there, felt wildly out of place at times. They even ported out a controversial running secret harem joke.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and a cynical portrayal of Krypton's parents wanting Superman to essentially rule and dominate Earth, not protect it. That's a stark contrast to the optimism and hope many others are praising.
Wow, yeah, that's very different.
So does this tonal disaster viewpoint suggest that Gunn's signature blend of humor and seriousness, which, works so well in Guardians, might be a tougher fit for a character as iconic and symbolically loaded as Superman?
That's a really insightful question. I mean, for a character like Superman, who carries such deep cultural meaning, represents these aspirational ideals. A tonal misstep can be particularly jarring for people. While Gunn's humor has been a hallmark of his success, applying it to a character traditionally associated with, unwavering moral clarity and earnestness, it presents a unique challenge.
Right.
So this criticism suggests that some feel that balance wasn't quite achieved here, leading to moments that feel maybe discordant rather than harmonized.
Okay, moving beyond the action character stuff, Gunn's Superman also explicitly touches on political themes. Gunn himself admits the film is political.
He does.
How is he approaching that, and what's the intention there?
Well, what's fascinating here is that Gunn emphasizes these politics are not like check-the-boxes type politics. Instead, he states they rise organically from Superman's core story. Him being an alien, a refugee from a dying planet arriving on Earth, and the values instilled by the Kents. He directly connects this to the character's creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, pointing out they were Jewish men from immigrant families who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe.
Interesting connection.
Yeah, it's basically an argument that the characters always had these undertones, and Gunn is perhaps just making them a bit more explicit for today's world.
So you can easily see how this theme of the alien as a stand-in for immigrants could lead to really diverse interpretations. Critics noted that you can easily read Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, ICE, Musk, and Trump into aspects of the film.
Yeah, it sounds like it's tapping into a lot of current anxieties and discussions.
It seems the film is landing in a very specific cultural moment.
It absolutely is. And this directly speaks to how the film's foundational themes are resonating and sometimes causing division in the current cultural landscape. NBC News, for instance, reports that the film is facing some backlash from conservative media for focusing on the superhero character's immigration status.
Right. I saw that headline.
Yeah, it's just an example of how these narratives, even ones in comic book adaptations, can become focal points for much broader societal discussions and, frankly, political viewpoints.
Okay, beyond the creative and thematic choices, there's just a lot riding on this film, financially.
Right, huge stakes.
Superman is the first in this wider reboot of the DC cinematic universe, so its success is pretty crucial for whatever comes next. Let's talk numbers. The budget has been a real point of discussion.
Indeed it has. The Hollywood Reporter initially proposed this hefty $363.8 million budget,
Wow.
which would make it one of the most expensive films ever, and that's not even including potentially another $200 million for marketing.
Which is insane.
Right. However, Gunn publicly debunked this, called it complete and utter nonsense. DC seems to be suggesting a more realistic figure, around $225 million, after tax breaks and incentives are factored in.
Okay, $225 million is still a lot, but more manageable than $364 million.
Definitely. Still a huge investment.
So what does this all mean for its profitability? The rule of thumb is a movie typically needs to make 2x to 2.5x its budget just to turn a profit.
Correct.
So based on that $225 million budget, Superman would need to hit somewhere in their $450 million to $562.5 million global range just to break even. Anything above that would be considered a success.
And, well, it seems like it's well on its way. The film broke ticket pre-sales records, trailer records.
And trailer views were massive, weren't they?
Yeah, the trailer became the most viewed DC Warner Bros. Trailer ever, over 250 million views in just 24 hours. Fandango reported its biggest first day of pre-sales for 2025.
That's incredible buzz.
It really is. And box office analysts are projecting a global opening weekend somewhere in the $230 million to $250 million range.
So potentially covering its production budget in the first weekend alone.
Exactly, which is a phenomenal start.
That's an incredible start for a film that's launching a whole new universe. And what's truly impressive is that initial projections place Superman's final box office somewhere between $700 million and maybe $850 million globally.
Yeah, that's the early tracking.
Which would mean it tops Man of Steel. That earned $668 million, and it was previously the highest-grossing solo Superman film. So this could be a record breaker for the character.
It certainly looks poised to be, and the critical reception has been largely positive as well, which definitely supports these strong projections. As of July 9th, the film holds an 85% critic score and a whopping 96% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes.
96% audience score is huge.
It really is. Reviewers have called it things like a magnificent feat, wonderfully entertaining, and a heartfelt cinematic reset that brings optimism, hope, and care back to Superman.
Okay, but it's important we note this isn't some unanimous love fest from the critics, despite that 85%. How do we square that overall positive score with the fact that, as we mentioned, one prominent dissenting review called it a painfully mediocre, super generic mess of a movie?
Right.
Suggesting you could safely skip it and just go watch the 1978 movie again instead.
Yeah.
Just pretty harsh.
Very harsh.
This critic lamented that it crashes and burns despite the best efforts of its sprawling cast, and that James Gunn's fingerprints are all over this one, and I think that's the biggest problem.
What does it tell us when there's such a strong divergence in critical opinion like that?
Well, it tells us that while a film might find really broad appeal, particularly, it seems, with the mass audience given that 96% score, it doesn't mean it's universally acclaimed, especially by those who analyze film perhaps more critically or have different expectations. This particular dissenting view suggests that some of the very choices praised by others, like Gunn's signature style or the sheer ambition of the cast, were actually seen as drawbacks by this critic.
So, the things some love, others hate. Pretty much, it's a reminder that even widely successful films can spark vigorous debate, and that audience consensus and critical consensus don't always perfectly align. There's often nuance there.
So we've taken a pretty deep dive then into James Gunn's Superman. From its unique creative choices, the key performances, those box office numbers and challenges, and the really fascinating, sometimes conflicting critical and public reception.
Yeah, what's clear, I think, is that this film is attempting a major refresh. Not just for a hero, but really for an entire cinematic universe. Moving away from that past gloominess and aiming for a return to idealism, kindness, and, well, earnestness.
And the initial buzz and those box office projections are incredibly strong. It looks like it's heading towards being a huge hit, even if some critics feel it doesn't quite soar as high as it could have.
Right. So maybe the provocative thought to leave people with is this. What does it tell us about our current cultural landscape? That a film explicitly embracing earnestness and kindness is being welcomed so strongly by many, while at the same time its underlying themes of immigrant identity also spark such strong opposing reactions.
Yeah.
And maybe also, how might these mixed critical views ranging from magnificent feat all the way down to painfully mediocre shape what we come to expect from the future of the superhero genre? Especially as it seems to be trying to evolve beyond some of its more established tropes. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?